Jessica, will you lead us in prayer tonight? Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus. Amen. The ushers will wait on you at this time. Let the worshipers arise. Let the sons and the daughters sing. I'm surrendering my all. I surrender to the King. I'm surrendering my all. I surrender to the King. You may be seated.
Praise the Lord. I planned about a 3-week small series that I've entitled "A Nation Under God?" ? Because this was a big month for America. I mean, we just had the election, and this week is Veterans Day, and then in 2 weeks we'll have Thanksgiving, and a lot of people don't realize what a national holiday that actually should be. It's not just a time of family gathering of eating some turkey, but it's actually more of a founding of a nation on the level of 4th of July, and it just kind of gets overlooked as such. So that was kind of why I did this. I was going to do 3 weeks leading up to Thanksgiving. But I'm going to see how tonight goes, because I don't want to turn our Wednesday nights into American history class. I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to stuff, not just history and things, but I enjoy the way that history lives itself out through Scripture, and how you can look back and see what God said and how it lines up with what actually happened. So I'll see how tonight goes. I don't want to make you feel like you're in freshman American Lit again. So I do want to begin tonight with Scripture out of 2 Kings chapter 20. And it's a short story about King Hezekiah. At that time, we're just going to call him Barry, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon. Everybody say, at that time. Barry, the son. Good job. Son of Baladan, king of Babylon. Everybody say, sent letters and presents. Pay attention to that. He sent them to Hezekiah, for he had heard that Hezekiah had been sick. You remember when Hezekiah got sick, the prophet of God went to him and told him, get your house in order. God says you're going to die. Hezekiah turned his face toward the wall, prayed. God sent the man of God back, said, tell him I'm going to give him 15 more years. So Hezekiah just got through that sickness, that illness that almost killed him. That'll be important in just a few moments, for he had heard Hezekiah had been sick. And Hezekiah hearkened unto them, and showed them all the house of his precious things. Everybody say, showed them the precious things. Okay. The silver, the gold, and the spices, the precious ointment, and all the house of his armor, and all that was found in his treasures. There was nothing in his house, nor in all his dominion, that Hezekiah showed them not. Then came Isaiah the prophet unto King Hezekiah, and asked him, what these men say to you, and where'd they come from? Hezekiah said, they're from a far country, from Babylon. And he says, what did you show them in your house? When they showed up and you thought they were friends, what did you show them in your house? And Hezekiah answered, I showed them everything. I showed them everything I have. There is nothing among my treasures I have not shown them. I showed everything. I didn't hold anything back. Why is that important? I want you to know, and I'll get into this story in just a minute, sometimes the enemy that you don't see is a lot more dangerous than the enemy that you do see. That's why the Bible is very explicit in a couple of places. For instance, Luke chapter 22, verse 31 says, Simon, Simon, the devil has desired to have you so that he can sift you as wheat. There's a desire that the devil has to get his hands on you. And in 2 Corinthians 2 and 11, Paul tells us, never let Satan get an advantage over us by being ignorant. Now, please understand something. There's a difference in ignorance and stupidity. Ignorance is because you've never been taught. Stupidity is knowing better and doing it anyway. And what this means is, if you are ignorant of the devil's devices, if you've never paid attention to how the devil wants to have you, how does the devil fight? I'm going to tell you how he fights. He fights dirty. He fights opportunistically. He fights patiently. We'll get to that in the next slide. He does not always come to us in a way that is easily recognized. He is a roaring lion, but he's also a hissing snake. You have to understand, sometimes he comes busting through the door like a tank out of control, and sometimes he comes in the front door carrying a Bible with a three-piece suit on. So you have to know of the enemy's devices. Don't be ignorant of the enemy's devices, because you could be messing with the devil and not even realize it if you don't know what his devices are. So as long as he acts and looks like the devil, then I know he's the devil. But sometimes he comes as a wolf in sheep's clothing, and it confuses me and it confounds me, and I can't tell if it's him by looking at him. I can only tell if it's him if I know his devices. That's going to be important as we get into this, because sometimes you wonder, how in the world did somebody fall for that? How did America fall for that? Because sometimes the enemy is closer to us than we recognize, than we realize, and we don't know his devices. Story of Hezekiah is a good example of this very thing. Hezekiah was one of Judah's most versatile and most valuable kings. He had led a revival and brought the temple back to recovery. He had a wicked father who used to be the king, King Ahaz. And Ahaz had let the foundations and the roof of the temple fall up. He had boarded up the temple and not let anybody worship. And he'd set up in the high places, worship places to Ashtoreth. And he had basically just backslid for his entire, and took the nation with him in the backsliding for his entire reign. Hezekiah came along and reopened the temple and found the scrolls, started having the readings done daily back at the temple, and had brought revival. He was a good king. He had resisted the Assyrian army. And the reason I want you to know that he had fought with the Assyrian army and won against the Assyrian army is because when Benny came calling, Benny was from Babylon. He's Babylon Benny. And Babylon Benny came to see King Hezekiah, and he asked him to form an alliance. Hey, why don't you and I get together and fight Assyria together. Now notice, Hezekiah had already resisted Assyria by himself. Judah had done fine against Assyria because they had God on their side. Babylon, Benny, came to see him and said, why don't you and I team up against Assyria? See, there's an old saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And when Babylon Benny came to see Hezekiah, he said, I want to be with you. I want to side with you. I want to team with you, and we will go and fight the Assyrians together. Because King Sennacherib down at Assyria, the king of Assyria is too powerful. And so it seemed like a diplomatic union. It seemed like he wanted what was best for both nations. And what Hezekiah missed, and what I'm afraid we miss, is that the real enemy was not Assyria. The real enemy was the one he was getting in bed with. The one he was making friends with. The one that he was allowing to see the precious things. See, it's not the enemy that we see all the time. A lot of times it's the undercover enemy that gets us in trouble. Now, if this is true in the natural, it is also true in the spiritual. I want to show you how the problem that Hezekiah had, and again, I don't want to turn this into an American lit class, but I want to show you how the problem that Hezekiah had in his day, not knowing his enemy, not even believing that his enemy was on his side, with him, influencing him. We've done the same thing in America. We wonder where a lot of these things come from. Do you ever stop when you read something on the internet or hear something on the news or read something in the paper, if anybody still reads papers? Do you ever wonder sometimes, where in the world did that come from? I mean, simple things, and I'll get to this in a moment. Like when I was growing up in school, we started every day the same way. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. We had some Jehovah's Witness children in our class, and they would sit. And when we did turkeys for Thanksgiving out of pie plates, they went to another class. But they were accommodated, but it didn't stop us from doing what we did. You understand what I'm saying? They were accommodated. If they didn't participate, and they didn't participate in much of anything we did. There was 3 Jehovah's Witness children in my classroom, and they didn't participate in any of those kind of things. They were accommodated. They had another place for them to go, but it didn't stop us from doing what we did. And so we started the day the same way. And when they started taking out parts of that, and they stopped allowing children to do it, my mind, for somebody who seemed it as harmless and dare I say even routine, I would always say, where in the world did that come from? How could anybody complain about something as simple as in God we trust being on a quarter? Where does that thought come from? Who looked down at a quarter and got upset? Who got offended because their money? Who thought, I'm not going to spend this? It says, in God we trust. Sometimes it makes me wonder, where did that thought come from? Hey, who is behind all of that? Pay attention, because this story that I just shared with you out of 2 Kings chapter 20, it's not the enemy you see. A lot of times it's the enemy that you joined yourself to and don't realize is really an enemy. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, but they're an enemy still. So you need to understand, how did America get to the place where we're getting offended over quarters? How could we get to the place where we fight in the streets, literally fight in the streets with one another instead of banding together against other nations? Where did this thought pattern come from? Well, let's look at this story a little bit. I had you repeat 3 phrases as we read through this. 2 Kings chapter 20, that first verse began with, at that time. What time? the time when Hezekiah was in recovery. He had been sick and he was still weak. He was vulnerable. What time does the enemy, God bless you, come looking for you? When you are weak and when you are vulnerable. That's when the enemy will always come looking when you have been sick. Whether it's physically sick, whether it's spiritually sick, whether you have went through some sort of an emotional trauma, that's when the enemy is going to try to come and snuggle up real close to you, because that's when you are most vulnerable. Here's what we need to understand about the devil before I get into this whole section about America. Satan is very strategic, and he is much more patient than Christians are. He will wait for years to trip you up. He'll set a trap when you're 7 to trip you at 47. You understand that? And he'll be waiting on you. He'll wait 4 decades for this thing to mature and to, as your life and time matriculates through, he will be waiting for you on the finish line, and you gave up decades ago on some things, but the devil never gave up, because he'll wait and wait and wait to catch you in his snare. He'll find you at your weakest moment. How do I know? Because over and over and over again, that's what happened to people in the Bible. Do you remember when Peter denied Jesus? He denied Jesus after Jesus got arrested. As long as Jesus was free and Jesus was standing in front of Peter, Peter was lopping off people's ears. Peter was saying, if they take you and kill you, Jesus, I'll go with you. If they take you to prison, I'll go with you. But when Jesus wasn't there no more, he was weak, he was vulnerable, and that's when he denied Jesus 3 times. Do you know when Abraham ran down to Egypt, God told him not to go to Egypt, and he ran to Egypt? Why did he go? Because there was a famine in the land. And he was weak. So the devil will wait you out. The second thing I told you to repeat after me was he sent letters and presents. Now there's diplomacy at its best. He did not come in. Notice when he decided to become an enemy against King Hezekiah, he did not kick the door down with swords drawn and horses and chariots. Do you know that Babylon actually never took Judah captive for another 70 years? The enemy is patient. He'll make friends with you today so he can put you in captivity years down the road. And that's what he did. And how did he become friends with him? He used diplomacy, not warfare. He came and gave him presents. You know how many young people have been pulled out of church because the devil put some good-looking thing in their life? Diplomacy, not warfare. The devil didn't fight them. The devil just set some pretty young thing beside of them in class, and they don't want to go to church, and if you're going to be with them, you're going to have to leave Jesus. That's diplomacy. That's not warfare. That's not the enemy battling with you. That's you giving in to the devil. You know how many people have given up and gotten out of church because they got their feelings hurt? Because somebody didn't show up at the hospital, or somebody didn't shake their hand at the front door of the church, and the devil just, with diplomacy, he didn't use warfare. He didn't come in fighting and battling. He just talked to them a little bit and says, hey, they don't like you. And before you know it, they're out of church. They're backslidden. They're on their way to hell. Why? Because the devil dealt wisely with them. So he appealed to Hezekiah's pride and his ego. He brought him some presents. These letters, they would have been commendations from the nation. They would have been official letters from the other nation. It was an honor to receive these kind of things. So he was bringing Hezekiah these letters and presents, and by doing so, he was telling Hezekiah, I respect you as a world leader. You are a great man. You're a great leader of other people. So Satan massages pride and ego. That's why the Bible says pride goeth before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. Because when you're jacking up on the enemy's compliments, you're setting yourself up for a fall. He showed them all His precious things. Because the enemy dealt wisely with him and there was no warfare going on, he got a grand tour of the house. See, when the enemy comes and fights me, I hide my stuff. But when the enemy acts like a friend to me, I'll take the enemy into my house and show him where my precious things are. Satan is after the precious things. I want you to know before I go into this next segment, he's after your precious things, he's after the precious things of nations, and he's after, more importantly and most importantly, the precious things of the soul. The Bible says that he showed him his silver and gold. That speaks to a kingdom's economy. That speaks to the monetary things, the materialistic items. He showed the enemy where his silver and gold was. But he also showed him where his spices and ointment was. That speaks to a nation's unity and their favor. That speaks to the ability that they have to draw together and be friendly with one another. And he also showed him his armory. And that was a big mistake because he showed him where his defense was. When the enemy knows what you've got to defend yourself with, he knows how to attack you. So he took him in as a friend, and King Hezekiah opened the doors to his house and said, "Let me give you the grand tour." And can I tell you that that's what we've done to the enemy in our life? When we neglect prayer and we neglect dedication to God, we give the enemy a grand tour of our life. We show him where the precious things are. And if he knows where the precious things are, please understand this, he's coming after them. When he sees where the precious things exist, where they are, if you shine a bright light on them and illuminate them in your life, and he knows that that's what's precious to you, that's what he's coming after. I don't know what the enemy is doing right now. I don't know what the enemy is up to right now. But I know if I show him something that means a lot to me, I know what he's going to be doing in a minute. I don't know what he's doing right now, but I know if I show him how to hurt me, I know what he's going to be doing next. I don't know what he's doing right now, but I know that if I show him where my precious things are, I know what his next plan is. Setting me up to get my precious things. So when we neglect prayer and we neglect dedication to God, we show the enemy where our precious things are. We give them the grand tour of our soul. If we're a nation and we make friends with the enemy, not knowing that the enemy is our enemy, we give him the grand tour of our nation and we show him where the precious things are. I'm going to remind you again. Where do these thoughts come from? They seem so trivial, do they not? The first time I heard that the ACLU was upset that kids were saying the Pledge of Allegiance, my mind did not automatically think the under God. My mind was, why don't they like the very flag of our country? You don't start out saying, "I pledge allegiance to Jesus Christ." You say, "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America." And I could not understand, for the life of me, I never could wrap my mind around how somebody could be so offended at something that seems so patriotic, so mundane, and so harmless. You're teaching children patriotism to their country. And then I got it. That's the problem. When I have a friend who's not a friend, who I've shown the precious things to, he's always working against me because he wants what I have. And so the things of his warfare will never make sense to me. I couldn't figure out why they didn't want kids to be patriotic, because they don't want kids to be patriotic. Why is that? A few years ago, it was 3 years ago, as a matter of fact. I know it was 3 years ago because this is the third year that it's going to come up for renewal. I went to a meeting at the New Martinsville Church of God, and they had one of our chief lawyers come from Cleveland and put on a seminar about something that at that point was unknown to everybody, hadn't even hit the mainstream news yet, called the Affordable Health Care Act. And the reason they had a seminar for us was because it was going to greatly affect the way pastors got paid and the way churches were able to insure their pastors. I thought I was listening to something straight out of a science fiction movie crossed with a communist nation. Because I could not for the life of me imagine where in the world our government got off making me pay a penalty for not having insurance. It'd be like I'd have to pay a penalty for not buying shoes. I don't brush my teeth, so the government's going to tax me. It didn't make any sense because in my lifetime, America had been free. You made your own decisions, and sometimes the decisions you make are destructive as the day is long, but you get the freedom to choose. This says right on the side of one of them things, smoking these things will kill you prematurely. They will give you lung cancer, make your eyeballs blush out, make your nose bleed. They're going to put you in an early grave, and people will say, give me 4 packs of them. And in America, you're free to do that. And I was sitting in that sanctuary, and I kept raising my hand and then putting it back down because I didn't want to interrupt. Man, I couldn't figure out what you mean to tell. I was wanting him to clarify. You're saying to me that this is going to be a national policy, because at first I thought he was saying that it was just church pastors. Then he was saying it was a national policy, that if you didn't have insurance, you was going to get taxed. The first year, you was going to get taxed a certain amount. Second year is going to go up. Third year, it was going to go out of sight. And then it was going to be, you were going to face possible jail time. I said, wait a minute. This is not North Korea. They can't force us to buy something that is optional. That's not, oh yeah, they can. Oh yes, they can. But where in the world does something like that come from? I was shocked. I really was. I was shocked. And today we use a word to describe certain people, and that word is liberal. When I was a kid, a lot of those same actions weren't called liberalism. It was called communism. And I'm going to explain something to you about where these mindsets come from in this nation that we have. When I was little, the Berlin Wall fell. And not too long after that, the former, what used to be called the Soviet Union, when I was a little boy growing up and Rocky IV came out and he was fighting Ivan Drago, or Rocky III came out, and it was United States against Russia, and Red Dawn was out, and every movie was always the United States against the Russians. And then the Soviet Union fell apart and split up, and it seemed like we were over the threat of communism. It seemed like the Cold War was over. But hear me when I say this, the enemy seldom just packs up and goes away. What he usually does is just changes his tactics. Because what did I tell you already? He's very strategic and he's very patient. So if you shut one door in the enemy's face, don't be shocked when the enemy finds another in-way to the house. So they don't use the name communist anymore because that's a dirty name. That's a name that draws red flags. So they don't call themselves communists too much anymore. However, there are more Communist Party members today than any other time in history. China is a communist nation. North Korea, we know these two because they're the ones that we're always having friction with. Cuba, where Fidel Castro, very well-known communist dictator. Vietnam, we know the struggle that we had there over communism, and it never went away. Russia, it's now the It's now Russia. It's not the USSR like it was when I was a kid. And Yugoslavia and Croatia and all those nations have their own nations now. But Russia's a much smaller entity, but it's still a communist. Much of South Africa, people don't know that. 6 countries in South America. We're surrounded by people and nations that believe in communism. And the truth is, there have been forces in this country working behind the scenes, finding the precious things for at least the last 60 years. They have one goal in mind, and it's the same goal Babylon Benny had. Make friends until it's time to be enemies. And by the time you realize I'm your enemy, I know where your precious things are. You can't hide anything because you opened the house and gave me the grand tour. Let me give you a little history lesson. Everybody knows the names Charles Darwin and Karl Marx. You know their role probably in communism. But perhaps the biggest troublemaker of all may be the third guy on this list, Antonio Gramsci. Most people don't know his name, but he developed a philosophy at the turn of the century. You've got to go back 70 years, 60 years ago to find out that Gramsci began a philosophy that if communists ever wanted to control America, they would not be able to do it with bombs and guns. Our standing army was too effective, and they would never be able to attack our mainland and beat us. So they would have to become us. If they would ever want to get America brought down, and if you think the world don't want America to fall down, did you watch all the news reports today? Because of who got voted in as president and what was going on around the world. Anytime do you remember when the towers fell on 9/11 and there were people partying in the streets in Pakistan and Afghanistan? Because they want us brought down. The world as a whole hates us. Always has, always will. So 70 years ago, the communists decided, and this was pretty smart, because hey, instead of fighting them, why don't we just move in with them and see where all their precious things are? Let's us just deal wisely with them. So Gramsci discovered that if they wanted to get America brought down, they were going to have to get involved in the books, the educational system, the music, the art, the movies, and they would have to, catch this, change American culture. I'll get back to that in a moment. I think I have time. I should have time to get to that. He decided that if they were going to bring America down, they couldn't leave America the way they were. They had to be patient and strategic. Who does that sound like? And change their culture. Because once a culture accepts there is no moral right or wrong, it's easy to divide and conquer them. Do you see where this is going? Once a culture decides there's no moral ethics, there's no right, there's no wrong, there's no absolutes, once a culture gets to that mindset, it's easy to bring them down. When this man was rising to power in the 1930s in Germany, he understood something, and he was way ahead of his time. He understood that you don't just walk into a nation and take over a nation. What you do is you divide the people against each other, because divided houses don't stand. So Adolf Hitler decided that he would take over the nation by getting them racially divided. Does that strike a chord in anybody's recent memory? They would split the people into groups and make them hate one another so they wouldn't pay attention to what was being done to them. And then, after they had civil unrest, they would offer for the government to come in and become a force to settle down the problems. Because if you're over at my house beating my head in with a club, and the government shows up and says, I can stop that, I'm more likely to say, yeah, go ahead and do that. Oh, but if I do that, you're going to have to give me your house. You're going to have to give me all your money. You're going to have to abide by everything I say. Well, go ahead and do it because this guy's beating me in the head with a club. Go ahead and do it. I don't feel safe when I go out. Go ahead and do it because I don't trust the people around me that are of a different nationality. Go ahead and take all my stuff. Just give me protection. Basically, the government become the mob. They become the mafia. They're selling protection. And today, the same kind of issue is going on. Because there are people behind the scenes, and this was proven in the election. And I don't get political. I think there's a place where politics has to stop at the church house. But I'm just talking about civil unrest. It was proven in this election that they were showing up at Trump rallies and videoing people fighting, and then it came out later that they were hired to go in and start fights so that they could be filmed starting the fights and act like perpetrate a fraud that they were on the other side. Because there are people behind the scenes that create chaos because they want to offer bigger government to settle it down. And when chaos comes, most people will step aside and go ahead and let bigger government take over. And if you don't believe me, do you remember April 3 years ago when the Boston bombing happened? Do you remember how the police department was going house to house looking for a man? They didn't know what man, didn't know what the man looked like, didn't know who he was. And they weren't asking permission. They were kicking doors in and walking in, and the homeowners were walking out the street saying, go ahead. He ain't in my house. And I was screaming at the television set saying they don't have a search warrant. They didn't ask your permission. That's a practice run. That's them seeing how much they can get away with. That's them saying, if you feel like you're in danger, or the block is in danger, or the city is in danger, that you will just step aside and let Big Brother take over. And that was a practice run, and everybody on that street that I saw failed the test. Not that they had anything to hide, and people that don't have anything to hide shouldn't hide anything. But there are protocols to go through. Because I see that history tells us that they want to divide the people so they can come in and fix the problem. It's called crisis strategy. They determined that they needed as many people. Now notice this. This is what Gramsci came up with. And he taught this. He said, we need to get America in a crisis strategy situation, which means we need as many people on government assistance as possible. Here's why. It creates an economic strain for the nation. And, do you remember Pharaoh? You remember when Pharaoh had Israel as slaves? And you remember when the slaves left Egypt and yet they wanted to go back? Because what they were used to eating, they didn't get to eat no more. And they were willing as free folk to go back into slavery to get the leeks and the onions of Egypt. Because when you control people's food and the money, they will obey you. This is what Gramsci figured out. You're talking about 60 years ago. The communists decided, if we're going to bring America down, here's how we have to do it. We need a lot of people on government assistance. You know what happens every election? You've got a red team and a blue team, and people are scared to death of the red team because the blue team tells them all the time, they're going to take away your free stuff. Because even if you're here illegally, you get free stuff. And you get to vote. And if I'm here illegally and I'm getting free stuff, what team am I going to vote for? The team who's paying me. And that, they didn't just come up with this. When I first found out that you can live in this country illegally and vote, I lost my mind. I flipped out. I became unsanctified for about 40 seconds. I said, what? They have a protocol. Take the class, sign the paper, take the pledge, and you're in. Why in the world do they have so many people illegal and just let them get away with it? And then I found out. Because they're dependent on you. And when they're dependent on you, because either you give me free stuff or I got to go back to my mud hut and live in my country and drink dirty rainwater, oh yeah, I'll vote for you. And I didn't know where the mindset came from. I thought that is the most backwards thinking that I've ever heard. And then I realized, wait a minute, I've heard this before. Israel was willing to go back and be slaves again because they couldn't find leeks and onions out in the desert. And free people that get to eat manna will turn around and go back into slavery just so they can get leeks and onions? I've heard that before. So I started doing some studying. And I brought this before this congregation once before. 1958, there was a book written called The Naked Communist. And The Naked Communist, they wrote and sketched out 45 current goals that the communist nation wanted to use against America. I'm only going to give you a partial summary of them. Number 28 was to eliminate prayer on any phase of religious expression in the schools or on the ground, as that it violates the principle of separation of church and state, which, by the way, if you ever have studied that don't exist. I know they use it like it's a clarion call from God above, but the separation of church and state was the state ought to stay out of the church, not the church ought to stay out of the state. Number 40, discredit the family as an institution. Encourage promiscuity and easy divorce. You would never think that all the way back in 1958 anybody would have the guts to promote promiscuity, because that's back when everything was still in this nation pure and everybody's watching Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best, and that's the kind of program. And women wouldn't even go outside with their ankles showing. Oh, scandalous. And they said promote promiscuity. Number 17, get control of the schools. Use them as a transmission belt for socialism and current communist propaganda. Soften the curriculum. Get control of teachers' associations. Put the party line in textbooks. Put communism in the textbooks. Use technical decisions, number 16, of the courts to weaken basic American institutions by claiming that their activities violate civil rights. Don't you hear every day that somebody's civil rights got violated and there's an ACLU lawsuit coming because of it? And it's usually something real important, like you didn't build me my own bathroom. You've had a his and a her bathroom all these years, but now I need one just for me because I'm one of a kind. And if I don't get one, I have a civil liberties lawsuit. It's everywhere now. It is absolutely everywhere now. Number 24, eliminate all laws governing obscenity. Don't allow anything to be called obscene by calling them censorship and a violation of free speech and free press. Number 25, break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. Number 26, present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy. This was 1958. We hear it every day. Do we not hear that point made every single day? Number 20, infiltrate the press. Get control of book review assignments, editorial writing, and policy-making positions. Listen, This was 1958. This is what they planned to use to get the precious things from America. Do I got time to go on? Y'all don't even know what time it is. Y'all saying yes. Number 21, gain control of key positions in radio, TV, and motion pictures. I'm going to get to that in a minute. I hope I don't have a soapbox around to stand on. Number 27, infiltrate the churches and replace revealed religion with social religion. Discredit the Bible and emphasize the need for intellectual maturity, which does not need a religious crutch. You know what's amazing to me? The first thing they decided when they decided to bring down America, the first thing they attacked was our morality. Because they determined that our morality was our greatest strength. Funny how our enemies could see how important morals are, and we can't seem to. Back to the homosexual agenda. Listen, isn't it funny that the very communists that want us to accept homosexuality will put them to death if they show up in their country? They don't tolerate it in North Korea. They don't tolerate it in Russia. If they find people being practicing homosexual acts in Russia, it is an automatic death sentence. But they want us to be okay with it. Isn't it amazing how they understand that if a country's morals start accepting certain lifestyles, it weakens the nation. So they want us to accept it. They want us to call it normal because they know what it does to the nation. And I remember when Bill Clinton was president and they said it's okay to do it in the military, and I lost my mind again. Think about it. Every phase of life, they want you to consider it normal, but they won't accept it in their nation. Why would you do that? Because you want the precious things. You're seeking to destroy your enemy, and you know what will weaken them and what will keep you strong. So they said, all these things I showed you had three key things. Reduce the sanctity of marriage and life. Prove that there is no God and that there is no absolute right and wrong. That's what they said they needed to do to bring America down. And as I'm standing in front of you today, here's the American statistics. 50% of new marriages end in divorce. And that number actually could be argumentative up to 57% of new marriages. That's not counting me. I've been married 23 years. That's not counting some of you that's been married longer than I've been alive. That's new marriages. That's the new mindset. And I'll tell you, I'll get to that in a minute. Why don't they hold on like we held on? Why don't they hold on like our grandparents held on? I'll get to that in a minute. 3,000 abortions per day. Listen, I leave politics at the door a lot of times when I come into the church, but I was proud that they announced last night that the evangelical church came out in droves and voted. I don't know how they voted, doesn't matter how they voted, but I know what got them out. They didn't want babies being killed. And that got a sleeping giant. And you know what? From now on, politicians are going to have to know, you better check the church. Because if you get the thermostat of the church riled up, we'll go out and vote you out. We'll go vote against you, because if you strum the wrong strings and get us, now we're bad for laying down and not answering the call, but if you do, we'll come out in droves. 40% of children are born out of wedlock in America today. 40%, 4 out of 10. That is staggering. 19 million new cases of STDs in this nation. Why? Because they said promote promiscuity as normal. It is a lifestyle. I got to leave that alone. 7% of high school students surveyed attempted suicide in the past 12 months. there's a spirit of suicide running through the land. So, maybe this explains why the left in this nation only has a problem with one religion. They only have a problem with biblical Christianity. Have you noticed this? You never hear a phrase like separation of church and state when it comes to Islam. As a matter of fact, a few years ago, the Dalai Lama came on a short tour, and they took him from school to school and bussed children in from other school districts to listen to the Dalai Lama. You think they do that for Billy Graham? You think they do that for any Christian preacher? No, they arrest us for speaking the name of Jesus Christ on product, and they sure wouldn't use taxpayer dollars to bring other kids in to hear us. But it seems like they only have a problem with one religion, and that's biblical Christianity. So they needed to have eventual control over two things. And I know I'm getting late, so I'm going to have to hurry and speed through this part. They needed to have control over two things, complete control. To get the precious things, they needed to control two things. Number one was the media. Number two was the school systems. If you don't believe that the media is totally biased, you're not watching the same thing I'm watching. Walter Cronkite is dead. Nobody reports facts anymore. All they give you is opinion. They have a blatant disregard to unbiased journalism. They tell you what they want you to think. They don't tell you what happened and report facts. Matter of fact, they will completely ignore facts, hoping you don't find out those facts, and they will illuminate other facts, so your mind will be forced to think about, that is terrible, that is awful. And those of us that are paying attention is going, what about this? This is heinous. This is a crime against fellow humanity. And they don't look at that. Well, this one said bad things. Because the media they have absolutely zero ambition to lead you to your own thought pattern. They want to tell you what to think. If you don't believe me, Google sometime the Washington Post in the 2008 election. The Washington Post, when confronted after Obama was elected the first time, the Washington Post was confronted about their biased reporting, and they said, yeah, we're biased toward liberal agendas, Obama in particular, and they said, so what? Not only do they not care, they're arrogant about it. And the second thing that they said, we need to control the media and we need to control the school systems. There's a man called John Dewey. He is given the reputation and celebrated as the father of modern public school education. And he was trained in Russia as a communist. And his idea was that if they got into the educational system, they could train the next generation to think communist thoughts, and they won't even fight against it. Because once children think like you want them to, they will think those thoughts are their own, and they won't resist it. Remember I told you, where in the world did that thought come from? In God we trust. Who could get mad at a quarter? Who could get upset because I said, I pledge allegiance to the flag of... Who could get upset? Where in the world did that thought even come? I'll tell you where it came from. They've been teaching this stuff to children since the 1960s. So this was all in the 1950s when everything was Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best. We usher in the 60s, and here come the Beatles. Their first song in America was I Want to Hold Your Hand. That song gave way to a song called Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which, from what I've read, has to do with LSD trips. And the teenagers of that day was eating it up. And instead of Leave It to Beaver, Bewitched become the #1 television program. A movie called Rosemary's Baby came out and became an instant success at the movie theater. And we end the 1960s with a little party called Woodstock that some of you may, I hope you wasn't there, but you may remember it. In 1963, there was a book written called The Feminine Mystique. It's written by a woman called Betty Friedman. She was a communist. Understand something. This book was the backbone and the busting out of the feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s. It was this book that caused the harried housewife to come out of the house and get a career. And it wasn't a harried housewife that wrote it. It was a communist. Because the communists understood how important it was to get mom out of the house and away from the children and put the children in front of television sets that they controlled. Show me the precious things. Show me where you have put your precious things, and I'll find a way to manipulate my way into their life. Their influence has been incredible, and if you don't believe it, you're not paying attention. The people who were protesting against America and against Vietnam War in the 1960s and 70s, they are now tenured professors in college and are writing the curriculum. I'm going to say that again. They protested. They burned the American flag, and now they're the ones writing the textbooks for your children to get indoctrinated. What do you think they're writing? You think they've had a change of heart? Ronald Reagan won in 1980 by a landslide. You ought to look at that. You think red and blue was something last night. You ought to see that map. He lost one state. And that's the way a lot of elections used to go back then, but there's been a huge shift since then because Republicans hardly ever have a chance anymore, usually. And it's not because liberals are having a lot of babies, because they're aborting theirs. The reason they're getting so many votes is because they're getting your children 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, and they are teaching them their agenda. There is a prominent anti-parent movement and philosophy in the schools today. They are intentionally reducing the roles of parents in children's lives and giving parents less access to their own children because their philosophy is we know how to raise them better than you do. And parents are more than happy to do it so we can go get our hair did. Something as fundamental as I pledge allegiance to the flag is now being rejected. And you know I hope you understand, it's not just because of one nation under God. It's also because they want to change it. There's a version. I pledge allegiance to the earth and to the flora, fauna, and human life that it supports. One planet indivisible with safe air, water and soil, economic justice, equal rights, and peace for all. That's what they want them to learn. They don't want them to say, I pledge allegiance to the flag. This is what they want to indoctrinate your children with now. And I say all this, and I'm out of time, and I'm going to close. This is my last door. I say all that to point your attention to who's really behind it all. Remember Antonio Gramsci, the Italian I told you, that was the founder of all this philosophy? He had a follower who, many years later, 1971, wrote a book. His name was Saul Alinsky. And on the opening page of this book, and this book's called Rules for Radicals, Saul Alinsky gave this dedication. Lest we forget at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the very first radical. From all our legends, mythology, and history, and who is to know where mythology leaves off and history begins, or which is which? The first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively that he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer. That's what communism's end goal is. That's who's behind that movement. That's who's looking for the precious things. See, communism is simply a godless system of government where humanity gets lifted up and God is reduced to a myth. That's all communism is. And it's very clear in this generation that the enemy is looking for the precious things. Back to Hezekiah and Babylon Benny. The rest of that chapter reads like this. And Isaiah said unto Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord. You done showed him everything you got. Behold, the days come that all is in your house and all your fathers laid up in store shall be carried unto Babylon. Nothing is going to be left. And of your sons, they're going to take them away. And they shall be eunuchs in the enemy's house. Then said unto Hezekiah to Isaiah, get this. He said, they're going to steal everything you have, and they're going to take your sons captive. And Hezekiah said, that's a good word. As long as I have peace in my day. We've lost the precious things. We wonder why. We wonder where this thinking came from. This radical think. Where in the world does that stuff? It's been coming for 60 years. And it was right in front of our eyes. And we never saw it. Why? Because as long as I have peace in my day, as long as the kids can be babysat in front of the television, and I can run and do my errands and do what I need to do, and now we've got iPads and iPhones and laptops, and now that's the new babysitter. And as long as I have peace in my day, I'm going to get the kids out of my hair. Yeah, but whose hair are you getting them into? I've done my children no favors by putting electronics in their lives. I've done them no favors. I realize it now. Too late for two. The other will suffer for it. The ox was up to something after all. The enemy comes for the precious things. And we don't realize, we wonder why this stuff is where's the unrest in the streets? Why is it race war? Why is it gender war? Yeah, have you noticed that nothing can never just be anymore? Now there's always got to be something behind it. It all has to be, well, it's because there's racism, or it's because there's bigotry, or because it's sexism, or it's you're a xenophobe, or you're a... Sometimes we just don't agree. Sometimes I just think that godliness and holiness is the way to go. And it has absolutely nothing to do with who you are and where you came from. It just has to do with, are you standing on the side of God, or are you standing on the side of the world? And I can't go to that side. But they won't accept that. They label you. Where did it all come from? It's been coming. Indoctrinated in